I really love this quote just as a way to kick us off, from the late Colin Gray. The function of strategy is to be a bridge from purpose to action. And it's that bridge that I think many organizations are challenged by. I know there's probably about 3 years ago, there's a global survey of CEOs, about 3,000 CEOs, and 80% said they were dissatisfied with strategy execution. So we can come up with a nice strategy. Uh, Even there, I think there's some potholes that we need to navigate, but then the execution of that strategy can be really problematic. So this is our dual focus today really is being able to understand the what and the how. This is some recent research that only came out in the last few weeks based on the last year or two of research from McKinsey and what separates strategy champions from those who struggle or stragglers as they call them. So you can see those three big buckets around designing the actual strategy, then how do we mobilize people and systems, and how do we execute? And it's interesting that only 21% of executives reported that their strategies passed four or more of those criteria. That's pretty low. I don't know what you think, but if it's only the six remaining, right? So there's a big gap there. So further to that, and I was working with a team yesterday where this was really was quite significant for them and really helped them craft the strategy as we worked yesterday. Was that bold piece particularly? So what are the things that stand out from champions and stragglers? And you can see the percent difference there is 25% for bold strategy. So challenging the team yesterday up in Canberra around, well, if you're going to have a successful strategy, let's make sure it's not, very pedestrian. What is a bold, really stretching strategy for the organization, which really, I guess, energize them then to have a different kind of conversation rather than being beholden to, government stakeholders or ministers or what have you. How do they actually really enlarge that? So that was a useful conversation. Any quick thoughts on that data? Either the champions versus stragglers or the previous slide around only 21% said four or more of those meet their criteria. Any quick thoughts? No surprises. Thanks, Andrew.
I have a question.
Yeah, go,
Is
Annalise.
in your experience, how do you see the correlation between that result and core values, either at the personal level or at the organisational level?
Are you saying, yeah, what's the role that values play in execution? Is that,
Yes, yes. Do you see a higher percentage in those organisations?
yeah, I think if an organization hasn't got good foundation of values and not just, on coffee cups, that they actually live that. Now, some of
Mm.
the work you and I did 25 years ago, Annalise, as culture champions,
Mm.
that can really support, I think, and enable good strategy. So I think we can execute strategy, but there's always a cost if the values are low. There's a human cost, commercial cost. Yeah. Do others have any different views or want to build on that? No?
I would say that, again, it's no surprise to me, and I think the hardest thing that you struggle with in management is that we build out all these strategies because everyone in the team comes to us and says, "This is what we want to do. This is our roadblocks. This is what we need." So we spend all this time building out the strategy, only for them to become the roadblock again.
Right.
And they're like, "Oh, it's too much work. I don't want to do that framework. Oh, it's easier the old way. I'll just do it that way." So it's that constant push and pull where you spend all this time strategizing. And anyway, I don't need to harp on, but it is that constant push and pull, right?
Yeah. And I think we will certainly get into that in the later part of this session where, we talk about top down and bottom up change, which is not a new idea. But I think
Mm.
for us, we focus very heavily on bottom up change. So it bubbles up, it almost influences, that's almost bottom up influence rather than top down trying to push down the strategy. Again, I know it's not a new idea, but how do we actually embed that in the ways of working and we'll talk about mechanisms toward the end of this session. I think that's one of the big missing pieces. We have a strategy. We might have a 1 hour presentation on the strategy, and then somehow we're magically expected to execute that and be engaged around it. And there's some massive gaps there, I think, in how we
Mm,
do that. So yeah, which is going
yeah.
to be very much the focus of later on. So yeah, thanks, Hannah. So, yeah, from McKinsey, the biggest gap between strategy champions and stragglers is actually the mobilisation piece, which is pretty much what we're talking about now. So, the crucial phase of translating strategic choices into organisational readiness. Lots of buzzwords there, but really, how do we get people from the top to the bottom to really engage in the things that really will move the dial on the strategy? That's the big challenge that we see in organisations. So these are the two parts that we pulled out from the research that we see as most critical. One was the design and then the execution. So they're the two areas that we're going to focus on quite heavily today. What the research showed was getting the right people who are engaged and empowered to actually work on the strategy, but then how do we actually do it every single day so that we're moving forward in service of the strategy? And your point, Hannah, how many times do we see a really beautiful strategic document which isn't really referenced very regularly? So that's a really great signal that there's a disconnect between the strategy process and actually the day to day. So I've personally worked with more than 3,000 teams over 3 decades, and I'm not saying I've run this strategic process for all 3,000, but I've certainly done it with hundreds of teams. And so I guess I've been able to experiment over a long period of time. And I think we take a very an approach which tries to simplify it and just focus on the key elements. And even though strategy is a cascading process, we know that once we get to the actually implementation that it's anything but a cascading linear kind of technical process. And again, I think that's where many organizations fall down. I don't know, some of the people here today really understand, the notion of adaptive leadership and working in complex scenarios. So that's really the third part of the session today is how do we actually do that? So yeah, very simply, mission and vision, and we'll talk about the difference between those in a moment. Values, and then what are the key pillars or strategic anchors, and then what are the goals and actions. So it is a very cascading approach in that sense. So there's no one way to do strategic planning. We've developed a methodology over a long period of time. Some things that I present today you may not agree with, and that's fine. It'd be great to have a conversation about that. So I'm not pretending that this is the one way to do it. This is the way we've managed to find breakthrough and cut through for teams quite quickly to get that clarity that they need and then therefore activate the strategy in a meaningful way. So I did this with the team in Canberra yesterday. I used the same slide. I borrowed it from this presentation today. Organizations confuse mission or purpose with their vision. And so I use the term mission and purpose interchangeably, just so we don't get confused. And this is actually from an online course that we developed last year around strategy development and implementation. So on the screen there, you can see there's 10 statements, and I'll just give you a moment to read through those. In a moment, I'm going to ask you which column is the vision column and which column is the mission column. All right, so if you think it's the column 1 is the vision column, just put 1. If you think it's column 2, put 2 in the chat. 1 for vision is the first column. 2 if you think it's the second column. All right, I've got a 50-50 split so far. Oh no, 2's starting to come ahead. Very good. When I asked this question yesterday, we had about a 50-50 split as well, or that feels 2 is kind of the winner here today, potentially, by a nose. So let's have a look. So the vision statement is column 1, uh, which is pretty interesting, right? So why is this table here and why are we having this conversation? If we're not clear about our purpose and what that actually means, and clear about the vision and the distinction between those two, then it can create a lack of clarity. So let's have a look. The For us, the vision is kind of future based, right? It's future orientated versus mission, which is present day. And so you'll see some statements which are purported to be vision statements, which are supposed to have a future focus. And most of them are things that the organization should be doing from its existence right through time. And so getting those two things is how one of the things, getting those two things clear is one of the ways we help teams get really clear on that, right? So let's have a look at our examples again. So you can see the difference here. So the Microsoft to help people and businesses throughout the world realize their full potential to empower every person. They're both purpose statements in my mind. Now, to be fair to them, they may have internal vision statements which they don't want to publicize, but you can see the differences here. Patagonia, we're in business to save our home planet. You can measure that; it has a destination, even though it's very, high level. So you can start to see some of the differences here and why sometimes people get quite confused. One of my favorite exercises is putting up 10 or 15 vision and mission statements, one asking people which is which, and also what sector do you think they come from? Almost never, because they're so generic, can people actually say, oh yeah, that comes from, fast moving consumer goods, or that comes from health, for example. So this is the I'm kind of starting with the end and bringing that forward, if you like. This would be an example of this is a made up company called Greenflow Technologies, which we used in our online course. But you can see the mission statement for me is really clear. When would that ever change? It probably won't, unless the organization fundamentally changes its reason for being. Like Nokia used to make rubber gumboots and then they made mobile phones. That's a fundamental shift in their reason for being. Then the vision statement has a directionality, and you can see we kind of separate both what might be an internal and external statement, if you like. So the internal one has a little bit more about commercial sensitivities, for example, or what might be really driving them internally. And so there's the vision statement and the by 2030 in this example that we would then utilize in the strat planning piece.